Do at the beginning of each day, mostly at the beginning of each week too, we give you a sense of what's happening in the news cycle and what you can expect in the next couple of days. And for that purpose, I'm now joined in studio by one of our editors, that's Olebogeng Kgosilentswe, who's going to be helping us make sense of the meaning behind the headlines. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Ayanda.
So let's start with what's on Newzroom Afrika's diary as a first, and then we'll move on to what's happening in the newspapers. Of course, we're keeping a close eye on various stories that sometimes have impacts on the global setup, one of those being the coronavirus. Absolutely,
and you know that it's quite a big story globally. You've just said in one of your headlines that the death toll now across the world has risen to more than 3,000. But with a particular focus on South Africa, today we'll be following up on a family who's concerned really about their children that are there in China, particularly in Shanghai, who the government has not communicated with. You know that 151 South Africans are in the process of being repatriated, and that process is going to take about 10 days from now. But this family, the two children that are in Shanghai have not been communicated with. They've written to the president to say, please consider us too. We know we are not part of that the group of students that you are repatriating, but we are also South Africans, and how do other South Africans get helped when others don't get helped? So that is what one of our reporters, Linda Mnisi, will be following today to really bring down, the effect of this process to us, this process of the repatriation of the South Africans that are in Wuhan, to say how does it impact directly on the South Africans that are here at home, the families that are here at home. And of course, our other big story on the Newzroom Afrika diary is the situation of the refugees in the city of Cape Town. We've been following that for quite some time. We do know now that obviously the city has an interim order, the city of Cape Town has an interim order to, enforce their bylaws, therefore removing the refugees from the city of Cape Town. We know that they've predominantly been sitting or living at the Central Methodist Church, and yesterday was quite dramatic when the removals were now being actioned, and it was quite a chaotic scene. You remember, Ayanda, one of us here at Newzroom Afrika felt the wrath of the police. Our reporter Atim Tongana was assaulted and manhandled by the police in that state of panic, in that state of removal. So we go back to the city of Cape Town today to find out, where did the refugees sleep last night? Where are they today? What is their plan? Because they obviously were staging a sit-in there because they had nowhere else to go. It's going to be quite interesting. And now, unfortunately, because of the incident that took place yesterday, Ati will not be able to be on the story, but our other Cape Town reporter, Nasipi Sami, will be on the story.
Fantastic. And in fact, we'll be speaking to the South African Human Rights Commission in the Western Cape as well, who have been a big voice in the story since this first emerged. Obviously, there are fears around human rights violations, not only to do with where they stay, but also the ways through which this entire issue is being handled. And
particularly, Ayanda, because it's Human Rights Month.
Right.
So the issues of human rights really come to the fore and are highlighted this month. And another issue that speaks to human rights indirectly is the lack of service delivery in the city of Tshwane. I mean, the metro has no leadership. We saw last week when council failed to sit, when the EFF and the ANC walked out of the council that was meant to elect a mayor. And we go back to the citizens of Tshwane to say, but how do you survive? It's been months of turmoil. It's been months of a lack of leadership in the city. And that obviously impacts directly on service delivery. So Sipa Kema is back there today, and we'll touch base again with the residents of the city of Tshwane to just find out how they're surviving, how has this whole impasse impacted on them. And obviously the city must also give us answers, as to how when will they resolve all of this mess?
The political impasse there certainly leaves much to be desired, so to speak. But let's turn our attention to the newspapers now. Of course, we've got some of your more popularly read newspapers. I'll kick us off with The Star this morning. A very interesting story. It's probably worth mentioning that all the papers have a different lead, which is always exciting. They're honing in on allegations that, some members of the JMPD are simply inept to do their job. They they're incapacitated and they cannot do what they're meant to do. Rookie JMPD cops can't drive or shoot. I mean, those are some of the most basic tasks that we expect some of our officials who are tasked with enforcing the law to be able to do. And the allegation is that, these are about 1,000 newly graduated Joburg traffic officers, and they were recruited back in 2018 and apparently underwent an 18-month training program at an academy. But, one incident highlighted just some of the phobias that some of the officials still have in moments of confrontation as they try to enforce the law. So there have been calls for all of them to be sent right back to the drawing board in a desperate attempt to try to fix whatever things weren't done. And, hopefully that will kind of see them come back to the streets in ways that they should be. Needless to say that, various officials, including the RTMC, who were involved in this process, have conceded that, in fact, the academy at which they were trained didn't comply with certain standards. And it becomes a really difficult thing to try and come to grapple with because, of the driving culture in a place like Johannesburg, right, where increasingly we're seeing this disregard for the law, which will inevitably sometimes lead to instances of confrontation. But also just the criminality on some of our roads, right? Outside of not necessarily following the rules of the road, there are criminals who, in many cases, need to be given chase, and there needs to be an exchange. And we remember the story of what happened in Alexandra, right, to the 31-year-old who was a newlywed, we've later learned, Samantha Khatebe, right, and she was shot in a crossfire between officers. And now, it wasn't JMPD at the time, but it certainly highlights the issue, right? The idea of officials not being able to handle these kind of moments with the least amount of collateral damage. And now the kind of, I guess, learning of why that might be. They've not
and it makes one wonder, Ayanda, as to how much was spent on the training initially, and how much is going to be spent once again to train law enforcement officers to be equipped for the job. But speaking of law enforcement, it brings me to the front page of The Citizen that reads, "Who's watching Big Brother?" Quite an interesting headline there. But it basically speaks to a company called Vumacam, who has installed 1,000 CCTV cameras across suburbs in Johannesburg. And now they find themselves on the wrong side of the law because they're being investigated. There's criminal charges against them because who did they consult when they were planting these cameras across the city? And they have misled the public or the residents in those suburbs to say that they were in collusion with SAPS and the JMPD. But the JMPD says, but no, we have no knowledge of this. So who are they acting on? Whose instruction are they acting on? That definitely, speaking again about human rights, is an infringement on the rights of the residents to freedom of, to walk around freely without being recorded, to the freedom of privacy. So it's quite an interesting story where Vumacam says they were acting on behalf of the residents to try and monitor criminal activity in the area, but they're in hot water for trying to do that because they did not follow the right procedures and the right processes legally. So it's quite interesting. But still on the Citizen, page 2 of the Citizen, there's a headline that reads, "Zuma allies will try to unseat Cyril."
Oh, gosh.
So this speaks to a story where in July the ANC will have the National General Council session that seeks to highlight the improvement or the work that has been done by the national body, the ruling party, since the 2017 Nasrec conference, whether or not resolutions have been implemented. But now here this article seeks to tell us that there's a group that is in support of former President Jacob Zuma called the Radical Economic Transformation Agenda for Zuma, the RET in short. And they will use whatever tactic that they have to try and unseat the president as the president of the African National Congress. But analysts here saying that no, but the NGC does not have it on the agenda to give a motion of no confidence against the president. It's just to see how, process, how things have been implemented since the last conference. But interestingly enough, they speak here of Ramaphosa having failed to implement some resolutions of the 2017 Nazareth conference, which one of the most controversial one of them is the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. But we heard recently in the budget speech and in the SONA that the president will be setting up a state bank and a sovereign wealth fund. So perhaps he is kind of speaking to the issues that they want to speak to, but yes, it's quite, what can I say, concerning when there's already talks of unseating, the president of the leading party, which then automatically is the president of the country.
Absolutely. The rifts within the ANC are certainly nothing new. What is interesting is seeing the different ways through which they manifest, right? Because at every opportunity, there's always an insistence among the top brass that there's a unified force within the organization. But more and more around these critical social-political issues, we're seeing those cracks showing.
Factions.
And and the factionalism sort of being unearthed, which is why the lead of the business day this morning is equally as interesting. I mean, it's picking up on a story that we've touched on for the greater part of last week, and that's obviously the showdown that's looming between labor unions as well as government itself in the wake of the announcement that the labor wage bill will be slashed by about 160 billion rand over the next 3 years. So, of course, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni certainly has his work cut out for him once again as he tried to walk that tightrope. Interestingly enough, though, the president will be meeting with labor and business leaders at their standing monthly meeting, right? And that's during the president's council at NEDLAC. But that will be followed immediately by the ANC's National Working Committee, which will be joined by COSATU and SAF, the SACP, I beg your pardon. And of course, that's the Tripartite Alliance, and we are expecting these kind of issues to take center stage because a lot of labor is crying foul about even the lack of consultation about, this wage agreement that was signed back in 2018 and the prospective changes that are going to be applied to it. And so outside of the in-house political shenanigans that the president will have to try and negotiate, this is also certainly on his agenda and another type of situation that he'll have to work through. Most of it is speculative. I mean, we know the ramifications of a full-on labor strike, in the kind of context we're in. It's certainly the last thing we need. But we also know of the strains on the fiscus, right? And the mounting calls for there to be serious cuts in government spending. And this is one of the solutions proposed by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. I imagine this kind of thing will certainly grab our attention, but only centralized once labor begins to act, because by and large at the moment it's always been threats, but we haven't necessarily seen any communications. I'm not challenging them. I'm not saying bring it on.
Because we did see COSATU say that war has been declared and they are already up in arms to fight the slashing of the wage bill. So perhaps you don't want to challenge them.
No, it's not a challenge at all. It's not a challenge. Obviously, one solutions, but that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming through and helping us make sense of these big stories. Of course, Olebogeng Kgosilentswe is one of our editors here on Newzroom Afrika.